My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. Before we begin, let me reiterate a few things. Firstly, I don't know that a historical Jesus of Nazareth existed. I don't assert that a historical Jesus of Nazareth existed, and I'm not sure it's even possible to know that a historical Jesus of Nazareth existed. I'm not asserting that any of the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, or that the Bible is the perfect, inerrant, and infallible Word of God. In fact, there are articles available for free on my Patreon arguing against both of those ideas. I don't make any claims as to when any of the texts were written, or by whom. I don't assert the divinity of Jesus, which is independent of the historicity of Jesus. In fact, as I have explicitly stated many, many times, and is emblazoned on my thumbnail and in the intro of every video, I am irreligious and agnostic. For that reason, I have no need to engage in apologetics. What I do on this channel is polemics. Whereas apologetics' purpose is to strengthen positions and arguments, polemics' purpose is to undermine them. With that out of the way, we can proceed to the topic of this video. In my last two videos, I have tackled the idea of Jesus of Nazareth being a whole cloth fabrication with no historical basis whatsoever. In one, I explained why Jesus' mythicism cannot be claimed as knowledge, cannot appropriately be described as infers to the best explanation, and can be characterized as a conspiracy theory. And in the following video, I demonstrated that godless engineer committed multiple logical fallacies in a failed attempt to substantiate his assertion that Jesus is ahistorical. To his credit, he did not argue that Jesus did not exist due to a lack of evidence of his existence. However, he did commit a non sequitur fallacy, cherry-picked, committed an analogical fallacy, a false equivocation fallacy, a special pleading fallacy, a red herring fallacy, and he burden shifted. He also misrepresented scholarship by arguing as if the Farrer hypothesis is fact, while arguing that the L, M, and Q sources are not just hypotheses, but that they're all fabrications, hence the aforementioned special pleading. What he did not do is substantiate the assertion that Jesus of Nazareth is completely fictitious. While I'm not certain, I have inferred that his view is informed primarily by Dr. Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, Why We May Have Reason to Doubt. This inference is based on the fact that he specifically mentions the year 2014, the year in which Carrier published his book, his argument from Bayesian analysis, which Carrier uses extensively in the book, and specific elements that he discusses. For example, the notion that Jesus is a syncretism between Mediterranean mystery cults and Judaism, the alleged attempt at bridging the gap between religion and people's experienced reality. And I reached out to Godless Engineer via email and by comments in one of his videos in an attempt to verify my inference. However, I did not receive a response. If this is the case, if his argumentation is based on Dr. Carrier's book, Godless Engineer has some serious issues to address. For instance, historians like Dr. Kurt Jaros, a Christian, and Tim O'Neill, an atheist, have argued that historical analysis doesn't always lend itself to the statistical precision found in Bayesian models, suggesting that Carrier's approach might overlook or oversimplify qualitative data unique to historical events. O'Neill, in particular, has criticized Dr. Carrier's reliance on mathematical frameworks as incompatible with nuances of historical research, arguing that historical sources don't fit neatly into the strict probabilities required by Bayesian analysis. Dr. Jaros writes, Carrier's usage of Bayesian analysis and some of his underlying assumptions are questionable in the way that they are applied to ancient history, and adds that applying mathematical model to the interpretive task of ancient texts risks oversimplification. On his blog, History for Atheists, O'Neill writes, Carrier's use of Bayes' theorem to assess the historicity of Jesus is a mess of subjective inputs, arbitrary assignments of probabilities, and other mathematical convolutions. He further critiques Carrier's approach as being largely unworkable when applied to historical analysis, which lacks the empirical data needed for any meaningful application of Bayes' theorem. Dr. Tim Hendrix, who has a PhD in mathematics, which makes him well versed in Bayesian analysis, is more receptive to the idea of using Bayesian analysis within the realm of history. However, he too is critical of Dr. Carrier's application, writing, "On the Historicity of Jesus contains imprecisions and omissions of important details which make the argument difficult to examine in details. The only place where Dr. Carrier can be said to formally go wrong in a strict sense is in the assignment of priors. However, it is important to stress that the lead up to that error is important too." He then goes on to enumerate the various issues in Dr. Carrier's methodology. However, Dr. Carrier's issues aren't restricted just to his application of Bayesian analysis. For example, in chapter 4 of his book, Dr. Carrier asserts, "There is no evidence really that Matthew was written in the 80s. He certainly wrote after Mark. As everyone knows, he copies Mark, often verbatim, and is in fact redacting Mark. But no, we don't know that the author of Matthew copied from the Gospel of Mark. This is just a bald assertion based on the Ferrer hypothesis." What makes this misrepresentation especially egregious on Dr. Carrier's part is that he discounts the Q source, and what makes this especially egregious on Godless Engineer's part is that whereas Godless Engineer asserts Q is a fabrication, Dr. Carrier doesn't. As he writes, "Finally, you often see cited as a source of early Christianity a document called Q for Quell, which is German for source. But this doesn't exist. It is a hypothetical document whose contents, redactional history, and even nature, whether written or oral, are endlessly debated in scholarship." So Dr. Carrier favors one hypothesis, that of Ferrer, where a combination of Markan priority and the later author is copying him, over another hypothesis, that of a Q source. And Godless Engineer asserts the former as a fact while asserting that the other is a fabrication, without providing sufficient evidence to support that claim, mind you, as the fact that we do not have an extant manuscript does not imply a fabrication, if for no other reason, because that does not account for oral sources. There are also issues with Dr. Carrier's minimal Jesus myth theory. In the eponymous passage in question, Dr. Carrier lays out the following set of propositions, proposing that if any of the first four is false, then Jesus likely did not begin as a myth. 1. At the origin of Christianity, Jesus Christ was thought to be a celestial deity much like any other. 2. Like many other celestial deities, this Jesus communicated with his subjects only through dreams, visions, and other forms of divine inspiration, such as prophecy, past and present. 3. Like some other celestial deities, this Jesus was originally believed to have endured an ordeal of incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection in a supernatural realm. 4. As for many other celestial deities, an allegorical story of the same Jesus was then composed and told within the sacred community, which placed him on earth in history as a divine man with an earthly family, companions, and enemies, complete with deeds and sayings and earthly depiction of his ordeals. 5. Subsequent communities of worshippers believed, or at least taught, that this invented sacred story was real and either not allegorical or only additionally allegorical. There seems to be at least the following issues. Firstly, that the truth of these propositions cannot be sufficiently ascertained. Secondly, that the propositions 1 and 3 could be true, and this still wouldn't preclude the possibility of Jesus being a real person, as what people believed about such a person is independent of the facts. And thirdly, that some texts include Jesus communicating with people in corporeal form. Consider each of these in greater detail. The truth of the propositions is hard to verify. Dr. Carrier's propositions are largely speculative and inferential, as he himself acknowledges. Since there's a lack of direct evidence documenting a belief in Jesus as solely a celestial being before the Gospels, he relies on analogy and in comparisons with other mythological figures. While Carrier draws parallels to mythological heroes to support his hypothesis, these comparisons are not concrete evidence and are not universally accepted as valid analogies in the academic community. Belief about Jesus is distinct from his historicity. Even if people did believe Jesus to be a celestial figure or thought that his death and resurrection occurred in the supernatural realm, this doesn't inherently exclude the possibility that he was in fact an actual historical person. In the section A Romulan Tale, Dr. Carrier draws comparisons to Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. While it is true that there are instances like this of mythological persons being historicized, there are also examples of historical persons who were later mythologized. In many cases, historical figures become mythologized, like Alexander the Great or the Buddha, where supernatural beliefs form around a core historical figure. Dr. Carey's propositions, particularly if understood as beliefs held by some early Christians, do not necessarily disprove the existence of Jesus, but instead describe how followers might have initially conceptualized or later mythologized him. Some scholars argue that these beliefs, even if originating in myth, could overlay or interact with an actual historical figure, creating a blend of myth and history. Jesus communicated and existing in corporeal form in some texts. The Gospels and other New Testament writings frequently depict Jesus interacting with followers, performing miracles, and teaching in a physical, corporeal form. Even the Apostle Paul, who Dr. Carey argues understood Jesus primarily as a celestial being, includes accounts of Jesus having a human lineage, i.e. being descended from David in Romans 1:3, and references to Jesus' death as a physical event in 1 Corinthians 2:8 and Galatians 3:1. Dr. Carey interprets these corporeal elements as later developments or allegorical, but many scholars argue that the physical interactions attributed to Jesus, particularly in sources close to early Christian movement, suggest an understanding of Jesus as a real person. Carey's interpretation requires viewing the passages as symbolic rather than historical, a reading that some argue is overly interpretive and does not account for the literal nature of other early Christian writings. It is also worth mentioning that Paul in Galatians 1:19 specifically and explicitly refers to James as the brother of Jesus, and while some argue that is interpreted as in the context of the brethren or some other spiritual context, that doesn't explain why Paul never uses this term to refer to anyone else besides James, nor does it explain why Tacitus in Antiquities of the Jews 29:1 would do the same. Demonstrably, if Godless Engineer's position is based on Dr. Carey's work, he has a very serious problem, because he either has a fundamental misunderstanding of the work, or he is deliberately misrepresenting this. Neither of these is a very good look. I say this because, as the title suggests, Carey's intent is not to assert the ahistoricity of Jesus as knowledge, but to provide reason for doubt as to his claimed historicity. He explicitly says this himself in the book's preface. I know that because I have a copy of it right here. The first two paragraphs of the preface read thusly. This book is the second of 2 volumes examining a daring question: whether there is a case to be made that Jesus never really existed as a historical person. The alternative is that Jesus, we know, originated as a mythical character, entails symbolically narrating the salvific acts of a divine being who never walked the earth and probably never existed at all. Later, this myth was mistaken for history, or deliberately repackaged that way. Ooh, there's an idea of conspiracy there. And then embellished over time. Though I shall argue that it's likely this alternative is true and that Jesus did not in fact exist, I cannot assume it has been conclusively proved here. In fact, it may yet be proved false in future work, using the very methods I employ, which were proposed and defended in my previous volume, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. Hence, the point of this book is not to end the debate, but to demonstrate that scholars need to take this hypothesis more seriously before dismissing it out of hand, and they need much better arguments against it than they've heretofore deployed. So, it is clear that if Godless Engineer's argument is derived from Dr. Carey's work, he is going beyond what the author himself asserts, implies, or intends. He has effectively gone into business for himself and metaphorically written checks that he cannot cash, as I showed in my previous video. The fact of the matter is that what Jesus Smithicists do not have is actual evidence of a whole cloth fabrication of a non-existent person passed off as a historical person of the sort of magnitude, success, and duration that they assert. What they have are analogies, comparisons to other myths, which might be more compelling were not for the fact that in addition to mythological figures who were historicized, we have clear-cut examples of historical figures who were later mythologized, examples that they too acknowledge. The similarities between Christianity and mystery cults do not imply that Christianity itself is such a mystery cult. To argue that Jesus never existed requires better substantiation, better evidence than analogy. At the end of the day, these sort of comparisons to fictitious people will never imply that Jesus of Nazareth was also fictitious, because, if that were the case, to avoid the commission of a special pleading and remain logically consistent, we would be obliged to accept the Dumas' Three Musketeers as evidence of the ahistoricity of Cardinal Richelieu, King Louis XIII, Queen Anne, and the first Duke of Buckingham. Yet their respective historicities are not contested, nor are the historicities of Armand d'Athos, Isaac de Poitou, and Henry de Aramis. The historical figures on whom Athos, Porthos, and Aramis are very loosely based, for that matter. If we take one work of fiction, even historical fiction, as evidence that the entirety of some event is fictitious or that a person is a whole cloth fabrication, then we must do so with all of them. Imagine someone a few hundred years from now reading fictionalized accounts of real-world events like those shown on series like Law & Order and concluding, erroneously, that the events that served as the source material for those shows never happened at all. It's simply poor reasoning, and why, once again, I say that these sort of analogies, while intriguing, just are not and cannot be the evidence that mythicists want them to be. If we are to argue that analogies equates to evidence, then surely we must conclude that the watchmaker analogy is evidence that a deity exists, and this is emphatically rejected by atheists. Finally, as the prior probability that Dr. Carrier utilizes in his Bayesian analysis is contingent on such analogical comparisons, it too fails to be compelling, not just to me, but to academia. Until next time, remember, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they may be justified nonetheless.